Welcome everyone to the Richard's Safe Workplace Lecture Series. Today we have a wonderful guest with us here, Dr. Jen Taylor. She gave me a brief bio. I know her quite well, but I would like to share what she gave me to share with you today. Actually, this is her second time giving us a lecture. It's been a couple of years since the last time she was here. And so this is Dr. Jennifer Taylor. He's the director of the Center for Firefighter Injury Research and Safety Trends, FIRST for short, and professor of environmental and occupational health at Drexel University. FIRST is a research, education, and practice enterprise at the Dornsife School of Public Health at Drexel University in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, comprised of data scientists, including me as an affiliate, epidemiologists, organizational scientists, which I guess is me too, and psychologists, also me. Cool. FIRST supported
the Joe Allen Center.
Yes. We all work together. It's wonderful. FIRST supports first responders through objective data collection and analysis on safety culture, stress, mental health, and injury. Dr. Taylor received her PhD in health policy and management from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health and holds the Certified Professional in Patient Safety Board certification. So she's amazing in many ways. Professionally, she's truly outstanding and has been doing really wonderful work with the fire service for a very long time. More personally, though, and you gave this to me. This is okay, right? Okay, just making sure. She is both a country girl and a city kid, having a small farmette on rural Maryland's eastern shore and a townhouse close to the best cheesesteak. Sorry, we got Philly.
Very big difference.
Cheesesteak place in Philadelphia. I have been to that cheesesteak place and I believe she is correct.
What's the name?
Yeah, what is it?
Oh, I don't give that away.
I don't even know the name. I just know it's the best.
So you can't.
And I don't want to get in trouble. Jen is known for her military precision in packing people, dogs, and stuff into her F-150 for all-day beach excursions, and is actively seeking therapy for what is becoming an unhealthy love affair with John Deere, which we haven't covered. So,
Yes.
anyway,
Very
so
easy to
without
follow.
further ado, Dr. Jen Taylor, welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me. Let me know if my mic ceases to do its job. And thank you so much. It was 2 years ago that I was here, and I was here for a week. And I had such a wonderful time that I'm now here for a month. So I'm, visiting with you as a professor, and I'm not teaching anything. I'm meeting with you. We're doing deep work. We're doing collaborative things. We're writing grants. We're talking about papers, and I'm meeting with students who are our future hopeful fire service researchers and occupational safety researchers of the future. So please, I will stick around after this lecture for those of you I've been talking to about doing some calendaring, but if you would like to meet, please let me know. I'm usually found in the Utah boardroom in the Rocky Mountain Center. Okay, so today I'm going to do something I never do, which is not really talk about my research and talk about theory, something that I never do. And in my work in safety climate, I was asked by a senior researcher, do you want to serve the fire service or do you want to contribute to theory? And I was like, serve the fire service. But over time, as scientists, we start to think about the constructs we're taught as we're training. And sometimes they don't fit as well as they used to. And because of my luck in working with occupational health psychologists and organizational scientists, my frame that I use for injury prevention and control has shifted. And I think that's a wonderful thing. And so what I'd like to do today is share with you my musings on a new energy that we should consider in injury prevention and control. The sixth energy, that means there are currently 5 that are accepted. And by disclaimer, I am not a psychologist. I am not an engineer. I am not a lawyer. I am simply a humble occupational injury epidemiologist. So those people that I've just mentioned are the people I collaborate with so that I don't make human errors.
Being persnickety.
Let's try. Let me try this. I'll just use the mouse. Oh, I have no idea. Papa, what did you do to my slides?
Not me who put that in.
Wow. Well, in any case, if you would all pray for me on Sunday, I'd really appreciate it. I'm not at home. I'm absolutely nervous and getting lots of supplies for the required nachos. So I want to first talk about what is an injury. And we have theoretical and operational definitions that we train people on in injury prevention and control, and I want to share those with you. So the theoretical definition comes from the great Sue Baker at Johns Hopkins. She's considered the mother of injury epidemiology. And she talks about injuries being caused by acute exposure to physical agents, which I will describe, that interact with the body at rates or amounts that exceed the threshold of human tolerance, causing some sort of harm, usually tissue damage. And indeed, the absence of these energies can also cause injury. The 5 forms of physical energy she was talking about are the ones that we control and try to prevent: thermal, ionizing radiation, electrical energy, chemical energy, mechanical energy, which is responsible for about 3/4 of all injuries to anyone, not just work-related. And the reason I have that is Bill Haddon, the person who's not me. I'm the first one. And in the blue is Bill Haddon. He's the father of injury prevention and control and injury epidemiology. And these are the core energies that he was concerned about when very early on he was studying motor vehicle crashes and how they killed people in the United States. And so I'm wrestling with his legacy and standing up to the father of my discipline. I was also the Haddon Fellow at Hopkins, so I feel like I can do this. Okay. So the operational definition of injuries hadn't really grappled with this because he was thinking about the distinction of injuries as compared to diseases. So the distinguishing feature in general about injuries is that the cause and effect are simultaneously known. It's different than if you eat the egg salad at the Super Bowl party and you develop some sort of foodborne illness and you're not really sure what the agent was, and maybe you go to the hospital and you get treated for your dehydration and other things I shall not mention in this talk, but you never really know what was the particular thing you are exposed to. And indeed, you may never know. And of course, in all types of diseases, we don't necessarily know what causes them. We spend a lot of time treating them. But injuries are treated differently, and that cause and effect are simultaneously known for the most part. So here's an example of a person at work falling down a flight of stairs. If he comes to us in the ER with a broken bone, do we know the cause of his injury?
Most likely.
Yes. And what is that, Dr. Thies?
Probably, falling on the stairs, mechanical energy.
Right. Thank you. Thank you. So well done. So occupational injury epi program, join it. And in most cases, this is the case, except for perhaps the work that Dr. Hegman has done in musculoskeletal diseases, where when we have repetitive strain injuries or micro injuries that occur and accumulate over time, we might not see them for a while, right? So there are those particular types of injuries as well. But in general, cause and effect are simultaneously known. Sorry, I keep hitting the wrong button. Okay. So, but the definition of injury is fraught. Now, I will say this not just because of my hair color, but gray is okay. Not everything is as clear as we'd like it to be. And so I can stick a quarter up my nose. I'm not going to do that right now because it's not worked out well in other presentations, but I can stick a quarter in my nose if I were a 5-year-old and it gets stuck, and that's a foreign object, and my parents will take me to the ER and they'll take it out, right? Why wouldn't they just leave it there? Right? It's not, maybe there's no tissue damage from this quarter stuck in, that's a lot for a 5-year-old. Let's move it down to a dime, okay? So a 5-year-old gets a dime. So maybe there's no tissue damage, but we're still going to go in and remove that foreign object, right? Maybe because of its potential to cause harm. More seriously, rape is a form of injury. Both of these categories are included in the nosology for how we describe injuries. But a sexual assault might not result in tissue damage. We still call it an injury, and what we are actually treating may not be physical tissue damage, but psychological damage, like depression that occurs after such an event. So people in the injury prevention and control discipline have been saying, perhaps this psychological harm that can happen from physical events should also be considered in the theoretical definition of injury. Interestingly, in my musings, around the world, this is not as much of a problem as it has been in the United States. So other countries like Australia and New Zealand compensate individuals who have had psychological harm from events that have happened, like an active shooter, for example. People not actually being shot, but experiencing the psychological sequelae of that can get compensated for the harm that occurs to them. So Colin Cryer and John Langley wrote a paper about, be careful with your case inclusion criteria when you're talking about injuries. And in the new nosology, the ICD-10, there's an injury chapter, and within it, there's a maltreatment syndromes section where we talk about neglect, physical abuse, sexual abuse, psychological abuse without any reference to physical injury. And so these are two wonderful injury epidemiologists, and they say, some forms of psychological injury are covered in the traditional injury categories of how we code things. They're important, they're ill-defined and difficult to measure, something that I'm hoping to disabuse you of in the next couple slides. But the other thing that they say is if you really want to capture all psychological injuries, you have to go to the mental and behavior disorders section of the ICD to capture them all. So this is just, not only is the problem of did physical tissue damage actually happen, is one gray area in injury, and then where do we put these things when they actually do happen to people? Okay, so as I've thought about this new energy that we should consider, I looked at the history of the field of injury prevention and control. And there have been 2 times in the past where its definition has broadened. And so I'm thanking Les Fisher, previously of Columbia University. He is the historian of injury prevention and control. If you know him, he writes all in little letters like E.E. Cummings, everything's lowercase. And it's really fun to read. But I was remembering these things, but I wanted to check it with Les to make sure before I repeated it that these were accurate statements. So in the 1940s, poisonings were conceptualized also as an injury hazard. They chemical agents acting on the body at a rate that exceeds a threshold of human tolerance. So poisonings became included mainly because of concerns with consumer products and children having access to household products. The second time the definition of injury was expanded was in the 1980s with the Surgeon General's inquiry on violence, which up until that point had been treated as a criminal justice issue. And if you wanted to prevent it, those were the methods that you would use. The 1985 Surgeon General's report actually looked at treating violence as a public health problem. And from then on, that's how it was thought of in public health training. So these categories are part of the ICD-9, the International Classification of Disease, which is how we count our cases. There's some other, these references are just here of other great writings about transitions in the injury prevention and control field. And so it is now the 2000s. It's a little later in the 2000s. And I believe it is time for the injury discipline to think about one of 2 expansions that I've been meditating on. One I will not talk about today, that is the issue of patient safety or medical injuries. Happy to be invited back in the future if you'd like to hear about that. I did a whole dissertation on it. But what I'm talking about now is the 6th injury is, the 6th energy is psychological energy, which leads to psychological injury. The sources that I've used are listed here. I don't know that you'll be able to see them, but John Langley and Ruth Brenner did this beautiful, deep exploration of the gray areas of the definition of injury in this piece called What is an Injury? It was published in the ICE proceedings. The ICE is the International Collaborative Effort on Injury Statistics and Research, like the geeks, right? I'm a part of it. I love it. We have these meetings every 2 years, wherever the World Safety Congress happens to be, and we all geek out about coding and classification and expansion of definitions and what are people doing with data. It's just a rockin' time. Lots of Thai food. It's really good. And there's other great articles here, such as the Colin Cryer and John Langley article that I just spoke of. But then the works of Bill Haddon, the father of the field, to really think about what did he grapple with in terms of the definition of injury. And these are the sources from which the core theoretical and operational definitions come from. So if you are interested or you're in the occupational injury program, these would be sources that would be very important for you. So when bad things happen, this is the Mayfield candle factory explosion in Kentucky from 2021, the before and after pictures. So we can see that after the explosion occurred, there's clearly a lot of physical damage. There were fatalities. There were obviously injuries that people needed to have treated. And oftentimes when these things happen, whether they're natural disasters like tornadoes, floods, hurricanes, active shooters, acts of terrorism, we see in the images from the media the effect on the person's psychological state, don't we? We see the grief. We see from the LA fires the loss of everything one has, the sense of reaching out to community for social support as you deal with that huge psychological force. So you may not have been physically injured, but you may be experiencing some mental energy from that event. So physical forces and energies can lead to mental injuries, but mental injuries can be caused from mental stimuli on their own. Now, these are the things that we traditionally think of that have huge psychological impacts, and we send counselors to elementary schools, and we activate EAPs in workplaces. But actually, the real trauma occurs daily behind the scenes without TV coverage. This is a story of David and Teresa, two former co-workers. This story was brought together by the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health, and I'd like to set the stage. And I spent a lot of money with the Oscar selection panel to select two very esteemed actors to join me today to share in this story of the hidden psychological energy and injuries at work. Let's begin. The longer he waited, the more David worried. For weeks, he had been plagued by aching muscles, loss of appetite, restless sleep, and a complete sense of exhaustion. At first, he tried to ignore these problems, but eventually he became so short-tempered and irritable that his wife insisted he get a checkup. Now, sitting in the doctor's office and wondering what the verdict would be, he didn't even notice when Teresa took the seat beside him. They had been good friends when she worked in the front office at the plant, but he hadn't seen her since she left 3 years ago to take a job as a customer service representative. Her gentle poke in the ribs brought him around, and within minutes, they were talking and gossiping as if she had never left.
You got out just in time. Since the reorganization, nobody feels safe. It used to be that as long as you did your work, you had a job. That's not for sure anymore. They expect the same production rates, even though 2 guys are now doing the work of 3. We're so backed up, I'm working 12-hour shifts 6 days a week. I swear, I hear those machines humming in my sleep. Guys are calling in sick just to get a break. Morale is so bad, they're talking about bringing in some consultants to figure out a better way to get the job done.
Well, I really miss you guys. I'm afraid I jumped from the frying pan into the fire. In my new job, the computer routes the calls and they never stop. I even have to schedule my bathroom breaks. All I hear the whole day are complaints from unhappy customers. I try to be helpful and sympathetic, but I can't promise anything without getting my boss's approval. Most of the time, I'm caught between what the customer wants and company policy. I'm not sure who I'm supposed to keep happy. The other reps are so uptight and tense, they don't even talk to one another. We all go to our own little cubicles and stay there until quitting time. To make matters worse, My mother's health is deteriorating. If only I could use some of my sick time to look after her. No wonder I'm here, with migraine headaches and high blood pressure. A lot of the reps are seeing the employee assistance counselor and taking stress management classes, which seems to help. But sooner or later, someone will have to make changes in the way this place is run.
Thank you, David and Teresa. A round of applause, please. Who knew that Utah was the birthplace of so many great actors?
Encore.
We'll get to it. We'll get to it.
Right.
So what we've just heard about from David and Teresa is a description of psychological energies that they've been experiencing at work and some of the health outcomes that are associated with those things. And psychological energy and psychological injury have a couple different names, and there are nuances among them, but I list them here for your consideration. So let's talk about the forms that psychological energy takes at work. So first of all, the design of tasks, heavy workload like David was talking about, infrequent rest breaks like Teresa was talking about, long work hours, shift work, hectic and routine tasks that have little inherent meaning, don't utilize workers' skills or training, provide little sense of control. How about the management style? Anybody ever been micromanaged? You don't have to raise your hand. I have. Word, right? Right? Psychological energy, nothing physical happened, right? Your manager didn't hit you, right? But they hit you. So lack of participation by workers in decision-making, lack of communication from management, lack of family-friendly policies like Teresa was talking about to care for her mother. These are all stressors. Interpersonal relationships, we can have vertical bullying and harassment from our supervisors. We can have horizontal same from our coworkers. We can have poor social support. So Teresa was saying everybody just comes in and goes to their desks. They don't talk. There's no way to get that release through your colleagues by venting, right? And the work roles, having uncertain job expectations, having too many hats to wear, having job insecurity or precarious work or lack of opportunity to promote. And environmental conditions like crowding. Cubicles are the most oppressive work environment ever created. Quote me now, let's talk about it later, okay? Not having a place to like change your bike clothes, those types of things, or call your mom at your break. Noise, air pollution, ergonomic problems, and violence. And so this is Bob Karasik's job demand model. I assume you're familiar with this, some of you, but you know, when we have a job that has a huge emotional demand to it, but we don't have a lot of control of when we work, how we work, when we get released from the pressure of work, we end up in this little red box here, which is called a high strain job. And high strain jobs are associated with health outcomes like cardiovascular disease, psychological disorders like anxiety, depression, suicidal ideation, cancers, ulcers, impaired immune function, musculoskeletal disorders, and workplace injury, especially violence. Why does anybody ever go to work? Because they need to get paid, unless you're a trust fund baby. I mean, that's the answer. So what I have done from the theoretical and operational definitions that I have been trained in is created a checklist for myself as I've mused on, is psychological energy and psychological injury something that we should include in the injury paradigm? And so I'm going to go through that checklist with you. So the first thing is it an energy, right? So Sue Baker and William Haddon talk about 5 physical energies. And so thinking about when I receive psychological stress, what energy is involved? And I actually was going to say, well, it's definitely an energy, but it's not physical. But then I thought about some things that I had learned in a previous life as a biochemist. So when we are stressed, right, our hypothalamus starts doing its thing and all the hormones leak out. And in a flight or fight, like in an acute phase over here on the left, we have that acute stress pathway. If the smoke alarm goes off now, we start smelling smoke. We go outside to our gathering space. We see the fire department come up. we're activated, right? Our flight or fight response is activated. But then when the fire department comes, put it out, we all come back to the office, we go back to stasis, and we go about our days, right? But that same stress pathway can be hyperactivated, where it never shuts off, where we never get time for rest and recovery. And that is the concern, because that is where we start to see symptoms and signs of stress having an impact on the body: accelerated heart rate, high respiration, high blood pressure, some of the things that Teresa and David were talking about. But so I was thinking, okay, but hormones aren't really, they're chemical messengers, but they're not necessarily carriers of chemical energy. That would be a physical energy. But then I thought about signal transduction, right? Haven't you all? Isn't that what you're all thinking, right? You're thinking that, right? Right, totally, right? Phosphorylation, dephosphorylation, right? So the hormone binds the receptor, the waggy part of the receptors in the intercellular space, phosphorylation, dephosphorylation, energy moves, right? Boom, chemical energy. Yeah. So I need to tell my mom that that college degree was not a waste. So we'll get to that. So thinking about, it's an energy, it's most likely a chemical energy. You can all call, you got the BS cards, right, that I handed? So there's going to be time, okay? So the next thing is, okay, if it's an energy, can we measure it? With electrical energy, you can use an amp meter and, you know, measure those types of things. Can we measure psychological energy? And yes, there's so much we can measure. We can measure people's symptoms, which can be a little subjective. We can do tests like measuring heart rate and core body temperature, and we can have them spit into cups. It's fantastic. We can actually do biomarkers through blood, urine, and saliva, right? We can measure cortisol levels there. So we can do that kind of sampling. But this is the thing I've learned from occupational health psychology. We actually have surveys, validated psychological tools that we can use to measure a person's degree of burnout or emotional exhaustion, or whether they're intending to leave the job. So there is so much that we can measure here. And these surveys, of course, I'm sure you all know, easy to do, inexpensive to do, short in time frame, as opposed to like going to, you know, Kurt's office and having him draw blood. I did it yesterday. It was great. He's got a very gentle hand. Okay, so right, yes, exactly. It really was. So it can be measured. Okay, so the next thing is, if you think about the epidemiological triad, the agent, host, and environment, what is the agent that contains the energy, this psychological energy? It's got to exist, right, for this to be true. And is that energy external to the body? So I'm going to answer these two together. The agent is us. In environmental and occupational health, we teach you the traditional toxins in air, water, soil. The new toxin, it's not so new, we've been around for a while. The new toxin is us. And with 70% of our workforce being knowledge workers, where they're not lifting heavy things and working in extreme conditions, the toxin they deal with most is not water contamination, it's human contamination. You know what this feels like. And I want to make a distinction between the psychological energy. If I'm Katie's employee and she's yelling at me in her micromanaging way that she always does, and we go back a ways, so I know what I'm saying here. It's totally not true. But that's an external energy, right? It's not something that's organic within me that might be something that generates bipolar disease or schizophrenia, right? So I'm making that distinction between energies that are external to the body and act on it at a threshold that exceeds human tolerance, causing some sort of harm. That's the classical definition. Okay. Other parts of the definition. Is it acute? Yes, sure. We've talked about flight or fight. And so Katie can yell at me once, right? And I can have a reaction to that. It might be a really big one, depending on how she yells at me, right? Sorry, Katie, thanks for participating. I'll pay you later. So, and so you can have sequelae from that one encounter, but you can also have this chronic psychological injury. And if you've ever worked in a toxic work environment, you know what I'm talking about. Every day you approach work and you're just a little bit anxious. You're worried if you're going to receive that negative feedback, or those requests to get things done in a really difficult manner. Not, firefighters have this all the time. They run so many EMS runs, they don't have time to eat, sleep, or pee. Any nurses in the room? Okay, you know why? Because they don't have time to eat, sleep, pee, or go to seminars. Okay, so, and that's a stressor, right? Just knowing that that's your work environment and not having time for rest and recovery from work is a psychological stressor, in addition to the physical things that you can experience. So it can be acute, it can be chronic, it can build up over time to where people, maybe they call out. Maybe they come to work, but they don't get anything done. What's that called? Thank you very much, right? And maybe eventually it builds up over time that they leave. And after you spent all that money, time training them, giving them that beautiful cubicle, they're out. Okay, the next question is there a threshold? And this is one where I've actually had to turn to the law. And so I haven't done as much thinking about this. I've relied very heavily on this book, called Psychological Injuries by Bill Koch and others, Psychological Injuries, Forensic Assessment, Treatment, and Law. And so this is where the term psychological injury is used very commonly. And they talk about psychological injury as referring to psychological or psychiatric conditions associated with a traumatic event or physical injury. And it might result from all types of behaviors listed here, abusive behavior, bullying, etc. It's considered a mental harm, suffering, damage, impairment, or dysfunction caused to a person as a direct result of some action or failure to act by some other person. The toxin is us. But they go on to say, because it's the law, right? We don't just get to say, Katie yelled at me, right? The psychological injury must reach a degree of disturbance of the pre-existing state of the individual such that it interferes with some significant way in the individual's ability to function. So this is where we start to see language about some sort of threshold. There has to be a degree of disturbance. It has to reach a certain level, and that gets decided along the process. So sometimes psychological injuries can involve these other types of things as well, like PTSD, traumatic brain injury, anxiety, depression, etc. They go on to say that the concept of psychological injury requires harm of a primarily non-physical nature, recognizing that there are some physiological conditions that can be measured that also support that idea. There's a threshold implicit in this definition that should be made explicit. And they go on to say that it's got to be enough harm to be protected by legal mechanisms. So they use the tort of battery, which is when I physically touch you, and that is unwanted touching, that is a battery, right? And so what I have done is violated your physical integrity. The parallel that they're making in terms of psychological injury is tort of an intentional or negligent infliction of emotional stress by violating your emotional tranquility. And it's come to be recognized by tort in courts of law. So there's much more in this book about how you determine a threshold. And clearly, as is the core definition of injury, there's an individual level of tolerance. So a person who is really resilient, either by chance or because they've done some work or they have huge social support, may be able to suffer more psychological energy before they exhibit a psychological injury, physical or mental in nature. But that's going to vary among people. The last sections of the checklist are cause and effect simultaneously known, right? That's part of the operational definition of injury. And so I'd say, yes, sometimes. And I think what's really intriguing about this for me is that there can be this latent effect, you know, where it's accumulating over time and it eventually reaches a threshold where this person has burnout and they choose to leave the job. We also I may know as an individual that Katie has yelled at me, and every day I go into the office, she yells at me. But the people who run the organization may have no insight into that. Her coworkers may know because they may see it, but the organization may not know. Therefore, it may be hard to show that cause and effect are simultaneously known in that situation. And that's where legal determination would be really helpful. And then finally, is there body damage? Right? This is part of the core definition of those physical energies in injury, that they result in some sort of tissue damage. But you can see as people have grappled with the gray areas of injury that they have talked about psychological harm, and they're not sure if that's included or not. And I'm saying that I think we should consider it because it's a huge factor, especially at work. And we know that because of the hormonal pathway, when you are experiencing these things and you never get rest and recovery, then we start to see disease states, we start to see workplace injury, we start to see health disease and injury issues come up. So, and then of course, in addition to, we can just have pure mental injury that occurs as a result of those work stressors. So at this point, I want to stop. And I have some other slides where I can talk about a little bit more about this from a policy lens and a legal lens in the fire service. But this is the time. If you see that blue little BS card, did they not get handed out? Oh, how unfortunate. But this is the time where you can say, yeah, but Jen, or what do you think about this? Or have you ever thought about this? Or I think you're full of bunk. Go see, you know, when I said, I think you're full of bunk, Ryan's like, yeah. Okay.
I think just a quick comment that, yes, that the sources of many stressors are social in origin, but some of them are socially designed and not directly involving people, you know, like the highly controlling Amazon warehouse where you've got tech on you that is controlling your minute by minute actions.
Yep.
So that was one comment. And then the other thing that I liked was making psychological exposures physical. The sensory transduction takes place. We hear, see, feel, experience things. It turns into it's transduced in our sensory nervous system. And so psychology is not a non-physical experience, it's physiological. And I appreciated that. Psychology.
Yeah, and that's why we have an occupational health psychology program now, right? And this is critical because when I was coming up as an occupational injury epidemiologist, we had none of that. And I went to Hopkins, just saying, right? So you made the right choice. But it's important. And again, I think there's more that we can do in the lab. There's more that we can do to measure these things. And even beyond what I've said, I think it just involves a more collaborative group of people other than me, right, who have some of this expertise in measurement, right? And I appreciate also what you're saying about the tech surveillance of workers at Starbucks as well. You know, you think they're happy to see you, but they're all being monitored on their headsets. But the other thing is that the agent I'm saying is us, but the agent could also be something like a natural disaster, right? That's not, you know, hopefully manufactured by a human being, but we're having a psychological energy acting on us in the aftermath, and then psychological injuries, right? If you've ever lost your home in a fire, PTS is not something that should seem like a long shot, right? That's really extraordinary. So, but for the most part, when I'm talking about work, I'm talking about us. Yeah. Thank you, Ryan, for being nice to me. I wasn't expecting that. He's such a high-level guy. Please, in the back, sir. And I'm sorry, could you please tell me your name? Thank you.
So no, I found the discussion to be quite interesting and very applicable. But I also tied it as soon as you started talking about psychological energy, some work from which you're probably aware of, Dr. Amy Edmondson out of Harvard, psychological safety.
Yes, I am. I use her scale in my work with you. Yeah.
Which I thought linked into exactly what you were talking about. So thank you.
Right. That's absolutely another, it's a really important scale. So thank you for raising it. You know, do I feel like if I speak up and raise my concerns, am I going to be made fun of? Am I going to be ostracized? So it's a very good way to suppress voice if you do not have psychological safety at work or in other ways. Yes, Ken.
First, I wanted to thank you for raising Haddon. I don't think many people know about him much, but I use them in my product safety and engineering stuff.
Wonderful.
But you were talking about workplace stressors and stuff, but of course, many of us have had traumatic childhoods or in abusive domestic relationships, and that shows up and also manifests itself in the workplace. How does that all fit together? What are differences or?
Yeah, so this is, remember when I said I wasn't a psychologist? This is where I would have those folks weigh in. So sure, it's not just work that causes us psychological injury, right? We have our own traumas, you know,
You
from.
bring it to work.
We absolutely do. So then if we have that already existing and then work also adds to it, then we have some sort of additive or multiplicative effect, whatever, right? So yes, I mean, and if we don't deal with it, perhaps you've had early life trauma, but you've actually dealt with it and you're resilient and it doesn't impact a toxic work environment, right? So yeah, so absolutely people bring, and also we have the organic mental diseases and conditions that can also interact, right? And there's been some lovely work in the European Union really talking about these types of interactions in that way, but also interactions from the physical environment and the psychological environment. So absolutely. And I have had it on my laptop. So if you're dying to like do a journal club when I'm here, I'm happy to.
And this is really the total worker health perspective that is emerging, evolving, growing, that we're whole people when we show up to work. And so that there's quite a nice collection of centers and NIOSH materials on the total worker health approach.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Matt.
So I talk about this in different ways in a lot of different settings. And one of the things that I encounter from others is this perception component of psychological stress, where Katie yelling at you, you may be fine. Katie yelling at me and I fall apart like a cheap watch, right?
Right.
It's the same exposure.
Yep.
And so I think people have a challenge of this differentiation, for lack of a better term.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, variability makes people's toes itch, right? I'm so sorry. This is life, right? Like everyone has a different lived experience. Everyone is bringing certain traumas or not. Everyone has, if you're a different age, right? You have different developmental coping issues and you have different amounts of exposure. So we accept that also in traditional disease, right? My exposure to toluene, right? Doesn't cause a cancer for me, but it does for someone else. Why, right? Epigenetics, blah, 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 right? So we just have to make sure that I think when we're making these arguments, and I think the measurement stuff is really important there to say, just like the traditional disease states that are so known by people, this really is the same thing. It's an energy, it can be measured, it has disparate impacts on different people. There are risk factors that are, you know, defective, there are things that are protective, and we just have to say that this is like that thing, right? Please, and your name?
My name is Micah Stratton.
Oh, I know who you are. We're email buddies. We've never met in person.
Yeah.
Micah, please, thank you.
I guess a comment and a question. Thank you so much for your presentation. It's kind of makes me think, you know, there's like we were discussing, there's so much variability to how this might impact people. But I think that discussion makes the case really clear that now is the time for it to be a definitive label. So like having that concrete, that sticks assignment in the energy so that we can start studying and understanding all of that variability kind of in an exposomic way. And my question is, you mentioned other cultures or parts of the world being more accepting of this kind of injury. And I was wondering, can you talk about your hope for labeling this type of energy or any direction you found from those cultures in terms of how does it relate to policy? Where have they taken it, and like where would it fit for us in public health?
So thank you for your first comment. I'm going to suggest you as a reviewer of the paper when I submit it. So I'm kidding. So I think, you know, one of the things we teach in public health is the social political frame in which a country is organized, right? So we're a federalist frame. There are lots of other countries, particularly in the European Union, that have a socialist frame, right? So I think that's a big part of it, is that the American spirit is, you know, suck it up, buttercup, and then move on, right? You know, lick it and go, right? So, but that's not necessarily the case everywhere. So I think there are cultural attributes to how acceptable this energy and its resultant injuries will be. But I think that's where data is really important, and looking at things like turnover, turnover intention, the cost that it takes to train new workers when others resign or are on disability, right? So we have to use lots of data from different areas, law, economics, psychological measurement, clinical medicine, to be able to really make these arguments. We do that with disease, right? The global burden of disease studies and things like that. And psychological energy, if you look at the global burden of disease studies, which I'd recommend, actually psychosis, which, psychological trauma, like went from like 10 to up in the top 5 around the world, right? In all high, middle, and low income countries. So it's there and it's recognized. We have to figure out what our culture will accept and then speak in that language. Thanks, Fran. Yes, Dr. Hegman.
So I'd like to, I think the Jurassic model was obviously an advanced period, but I'm gonna pick on it
Okay.
because I think it needs a lot of thought. There's no way everybody wants maximum control over everything all the time. It just isn't. And we've all been there, right? We've all had projects or whatever. We're like, you know what, somebody else is better at leading this than I am. And let's ride that person, and that's giving control, and what I'm getting at is you could pixelate that 4-box figure. And I think at any given moment, first of all, we'd be in different parts of that figure. And I've already told you my mother-in-law loved exactly what everybody says you're not supposed to like. And there's all kinds of people like that. They like assembly line work. They really do.
Right.
And the point being, that's also, if we have to realize where people are then and what they want, then the stress comes when they're not there, wherever that is in that figure. And so this issue of everybody's an average, we all want to be high control, low demand positions, I think is really, it was a place to start with the model, but I looking at it, it's only got a very thin relationship to reality. That's how I look at it.
Right. No, and I can see how that can be interpreted as an oversimplification, but I think in that model is the idea of personal autonomy. So do I want to be in charge? The answer to that is always yes. Or do I want somebody else to take charge? But having the ability to be who I want to be in that situation is control.
Well, but I want Joe to run the occupational environmental health programs. The last thing I want to do is do that, and I want Matt to teach occupational epidemiology. I don't want to do that. I did that years ago.
But you're the boss and you have the autonomy and control to delegate.
But I don't do that. I let everybody step up to the plate when they want, and smack the bat, I mean, seriously, and so I'd actually say, no, that's, and maybe I'm a weirdo, but that's.
Well, we definitely all agree on that, but we also, but all your wishes have come true, Kurt. So,
Right.
by hook or by crook, it's happening as you've envisioned it. So absolutely nothing that I'm suggesting today is without, counter arguments, which is the point of science, right? So this is the beauty of it. And by having these types of conversations, we can go back to, the design table and redo our work. This is the point of peer review and collaboration and having diverse voices in your research group. Absolutely, nothing wrong with that. Yes.
Real quick comment on Kurt's comments. I worked with a guy named Jerry Berger, personality psychologist at Santa Clara University.
Okay.
And he studied individual differences in the desirability of control. And there's a scale, and it's a pretty interesting measure. There's certain people choose certain types of work if they score higher or lower on that scale. So Jerry Berger, desirability of control.
Okay.
Interesting.
I'll write that down when we meet this afternoon. Yes, please.
Just out of curiosity, for the checklist, all the checklist items that you
Yeah.
had, what would you say you feel the least confident in for this argument, or you would see having the most scrutiny from your own perspective?
Yeah, so this is a great question. And so at 2:00 in the morning, I would have said the physical energy component, but I could not sleep because the gentleman who lives above me is a either professional or amateur clog dancer. And so I actually started, so I think you try to be, I try to be, Kurt, my own critic, right? And this is where I started to think about this physical energy piece. I like don't have a solid argument here. And then I thought about phosphorylation, because that's what you think about at 2:30 in the morning is phosphorylation, dephosphorylation. And then I started to think, okay, well, isn't ATP the chemical energy of the intracellular space? And I'm like, oh my God, right? So, but again, that may be true. How do we measure that in a human being who's undergoing psychological stress? That might be a little different. So that's why we use some of these other measures. So I think that was where I was very early this morning. But now I've got Kurt's comments to consider too. So who knows where I am now? I mean, I know where I am. I'm in Utah. But who knows, right? But that's the point, is the point of this is to be, as scientists, to proffer and be submissive in the right sense of the word, not in a weak sense of the word, but to say to your colleagues, this is what I'm thinking. Am I high, right? I'm not. But what do you think? How would you want to workshop your arguments with your colleagues first, before you step out on this space. So, and there's not going to be total agreement on it, but that was where I was. Now I feel even more confident, sleep deprived, but confident. Please, yes.
Got a comment online from Dr. Leslie.
Yes.
Says psychological stress is unique in that a certain amount can foster resilience and personal growth, while excessive distress causes harm. Given your epidemiology background, which emphasizes complete prevention from harmful exposures such as toxins, I'm curious about your perspective on navigating this balance in psychological energy interventions.
Wow. When I ask a question in a seminar, I'm like, can you clarify what you said on slide? So thank you, Dr. Leslie. Can you repeat the question, Bubba?
Yes, she's curious about given your epidemiology background that emphasizes complete prevention from harmful exposures such as toxins. She's curious about your perspective on navigating the balance in psychological energy interventions with respect to the fact that some psychological stress can promote resilience, but too much is bad. And so how do you think about that balance?
Yeah, so I think, and actually to answer the previous question, this threshold level, I mean, and again, the only strong evidence that I've given is from the law, but I think really looking at that variance within individuals and getting a sense of, how wide is that interval, right? And then what works for one individual, like cognitive behavioral therapy, might not work for another one. So understanding a little bit about that, but also understanding that there's people, especially at work, people's experiences are very clustered. So they may have individual variations from previous experience, but they're also experiencing the same psychological energy, perhaps, right? So in an intervention space, then, thinking about workplace design and or work organization, right? So thinking about what policies allow people to take a restroom break. And I know that sounds really basic, but in the fire service, this is the thing that's really hard. And when I make policies with fire departments, this is the thing I get the most pushback on. They don't have time to take a break, right? Like peeing is optional, right? So I think when it comes to interventions, we can think about structural types of interventions that benefit everyone, as opposed to like an individual benefit, like Jen, you need to go get some help. Whereas we need to think about our workflow, as David was talking about, and how do we make sure that people aren't working 12-hour days for 6 days a week. So it's a signal that something might be wrong in the system if people are showing adverse effects. Maybe they're not. Maybe they're just a highly resilient lot that's got nothing better to do than work all the time. Right. So we have to, I think, structural interventions, policy interventions that benefit everyone will probably do the most good. But capture that, because I want to think on that some more. Please, your name?
Kevin. So, have you made much of a conceptual distinction between kind of, I guess, incidental exposures where like, oh, your boss is a jerk and he yells at you every day, versus kind of our Amazon example where that stress is kind of integral to the way that that work is organized? And do you think that there's kind of do you think one or the other is a better kind of target for study to begin with? as far as kind of pushing the research agenda.
So I would argue that your example is the same, right? A boss who's consistently a jerk every day or toxic every day is not any different than being technologically surveilled at work for your productivity, right? I mean, it's a constant stressor. If I have a bad day as your boss and I'm like, oh, I'm so sorry, like I totally, that's different. But if every day I'm going to be breathing down your neck, it's psychological energy, right? So whether it comes from technology or there could be variance in whether it's human energy versus technical energy. It's a good thing to think about, and I will. But I think in that particular example, they're the same.
As a researcher, like for us, we have that role, right? And that if there is some occupational, like organizational thing, we could make recommendations to the organization. But for those having a toxic boss, we can't do anything if people have, because we don't have any authority to change.
Right. So So how to rework your toxic boss? Sure. So that can be hard to conceptualize, but that's where training and policy should really be very helpful in modifying the behavior of an individual. So managers don't just get to act on their own. If they're employees of an organization, there are codes of conduct, ethics, ways of, mission and value things, of ways to treat people. So again, how well the organization is making sure that people are faithful to those ideas may totally go in the toilet, right? And people, a lot of times it's so much easier to look the other way than to say to somebody, you're being a jerk, what's up, right? I think it's really important to think about structures as opposed to like interpersonal stuff. That's important too. But let's really think about, when we're thinking about work organizations, the structures we can put into place that change the way that environment operates for everyone. So it's not just that Jen has childhood trauma, therefore she's going to have a hard time accepting feedback that her writing needs to improve. It's that we're going to have a set of expectations about, what our products should look like so people can read them, understand them, act on them, et cetera. Yes, Dr. Allen.
So there's a lot of interventions and processes and things that psychologists, whether it be industrial and organizational psychologists or occupational health psychologists or others in that space, that have done things to address issues such as, abusive boss or bad coworkers, et cetera, et cetera. How do you see, where do you see the bridge between those interventions that have been tested and studied in one area interacting or connecting with this concept of psychological energy in other disciplines? Because it feels like this is almost like a bridging, connecting epidemiology, injury prevention, and psychology, which hasn't really taken an injury framework in their understanding of how this operates. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and again, this is a much longer conversation, but this is why. I mean, it's really a slide that I have in the future about the importance of integrating occupational health psychology and organizational science into traditional injury prevention and control training.
Yeah.
So you and I both work on safety climate, the most upstream predictor of occupational injury. And it is unusual for people in classic injury prevention and control training programs to have that exposure. That's why I'm so delighted about the OHP program that exists here, because you're going to get something that trainees don't get everywhere. So I think that's it helps us really think about work organization. I think injury also adds this structure, right, of host, environment, agent, to give multiple opportunities and primary, secondary, and tertiary prevention on those agents and environments and hosts to, think more systemically, right? So that's why we work together, right? Yeah. So I have, I know we're done at 12 o'clock. I have extra slides in here about, does workers' compensation actually compensate for psychological injury? And the answer is yes. So it's in the slides, which Bubba has, which I'm sure he'll send to you all. But that's really a salutatory ending, because it actually is something that is there as a benefit for employees. They may not know it, as Kurt and I were talking about the other day, but it's there. And that's important for you to know, and you can capture it. There's nosology. It can be captured, stress at work and its impact as a nature of injury.
So thank you, Dr. Taylor.